This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
On September 20 through 23, 1976, a four-night public debate was held in the Coliseum on the campus of North Texas State University in Denton. The debate was over the existence of God, and it was a classic confrontation between the Bible and atheism. Dr. Thomas B. Warren, a professor of philosophy and apologetics, and also a preacher for the Lord's Church, defended the proposition, "I know that God exists." Dr. Antony Flew, a professor of philosophy from England, affirmed the atheistic proposition, "I know that God does not exist." As was said, the debate, of course, is a classic, and we would encourage everybody to either read the book or else watch the videotapes of it. That was 20 years ago, and now, 1996, is the 20-year anniversary of the Warren-Flew debate. I'm Waylon Deaver, and I work with the World Video Bible School. And we thought that it would be appropriate to go back 2 decades later and talk to Brother Warren and get his thoughts about this historic debate. So we're here in the Warren home, and we're very pleased that Brother Warren has consented to sit down with us and to answer some questions about this. We're glad to have you with us, Brother Warren.
Thank you. It's a sincere pleasure for me to be with you.
Why don't we begin by setting some of the background for how the debate came about?
Okay. I wonder if you'd mind if I said just a bit about some of the dearest friends on earth of mine.
Sure.
Your grandfather, Roy Deaver, and I have been very, very close friends for a long time. And it's been the practice of both of us to call each other at times and talk over certain things. And he's been such a wonderful help to me. And as time has gone on, your father and even you have been wonderful helps to me. And I just wanted to let the people know that there's not anybody on earth that I appreciate more than your grandfather. And I came in contact with Dr. Flew when I heard that he was going to speak at a meeting, the annual meeting of the Philosophical Association in the United States, the sort of upper crust one. And so I flew out there and heard him speaking, and he was really tearing into the whole crowd. It was really a sort of a castigating type of thing, it seemed to me. And yet he was saying things that I knew he had no ground for saying. He was basically an atheist, and he felt very strongly about it, as far as I could tell. And so there was a friend of mine sitting next to me, and he was the president of a university in the Los Angeles area. And he said, "Tom, you're going to have to get into this because it's really getting out of hand." And so I said, "Well, you get into it." And he said, "No, I don't need to get into that. Not with that fellow." And so first opportunity I got, when he stopped and asked for if anybody had something to say, I spoke up, and lo and behold, he noticed me and acknowledged me. And so I asked him a few questions, and I could tell that he wasn't taking too kindly to them. He had been very strongly speaking to the whole audience. It sort of castigated the whole audience for not being strong for atheism, as I recall it. That may not be just exactly the point. But at any rate, he said, in answer to my counter to one of his things, he said, "Listen, that's not the way it is," and so forth and so on. And so I said, "Well, Dr. Flew, there's one thing you've convinced me of, is that you are very shifty. You take one position one moment and another position the next moment." And it made him very angry. I mean, he really burned. And he whirled around, had a little lectern there, and he slammed his fist down on it and said, "I may be many things, but I'm not shifty." And we proceeded a little bit there to show how he was shifty. I said, "A little bit ago you took this position. Then a little bit after that you took this position, and then you took this position," all of them contradicting each other. And oh, he really didn't like that at all. And so that's the first time that I came into contact with him. But a little later, the brethren in the United States here wanted me to take on somebody in a public debate on the existence of God. And I said, well, I suppose he would be as good as anybody. And so we contacted him, and he eagerly jumped into it. I don't know whether he remembered me as the one who asked those questions for him or not, but at any rate, we got the thing scheduled. And it happened as a result of that.
What were your credentials going into the debate? How had you prepared yourself to participate in a discussion like that?
Yes, well, it required academic participation, qualification. I don't think a man with Dr. Flew's credentials would have been interested at all if I had not had a doctorate. But I had the bachelor's degree from Abilene Christian College, and the master's degree from the University of Houston, and a master's degree from Vanderbilt University, and a PhD from Vanderbilt University.
You must have had a lot of interesting experiences studying under atheistic professors or denominational professors, and having to sit through classes taught by those people.
Yes, I also attended some religious type schools. One is, I suppose it was at that time, the largest religious school in the world for, graduate study. But I found that it was the proper thing to do. If you didn't agree with something, then you could speak up. So I spoke up, and they were not supposed to mark me down because I did that. On one or two occasions, I think a fellow maybe might have marked me down one grade, but I had some very, very interesting situations. I'd go to an office of a professor, and they had certain hours, that you could come and talk. And but I found that as soon as I opened the door to go in, they didn't exactly, not all of them, but some of them, most of them. One man I remember, he was pointed out as such a great scholar, but I found out he didn't even know how to handle Acts 2:38, and very easily. And as we discussed it back and forth, he stood up behind his desk and put his hand over his heart and said, "Ever since I trusted Jesus as my personal Savior, I've never had any doubt about my salvation." I said, "Well, that's all very interesting, but that's not the way to decide it. Mm-hmm. You need to decide it from the Scriptures, and I'm still asking you about Acts 2:38. And he said, "Well, I don't want to say any more about it." And so that was the way it was there. And I left after 2 years without getting a degree. It took a 3-year degree there, but I decided that I didn't want to get it there anyway. So I went to TCU. And this gave me from, the rather conservative Baptists into very liberal people that, go back to, should be members of the church, but they weren't anymore. And, but I found the professors there much more willing for me to speak out. And I remember one fellow, he was an old man, but a very kind type fellow. I asked him a question in class, and he couldn't answer it. And so I waited for him after class, and we had a discussion out in the hallway, and finally he just downed his head like that and looked down on the floor for a good while, and finally raised his head up and he says, "Warren, you're trying to get me into a logical bind." I said, "Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help you to see that you've got to give up that doctrine." Mm-hmm. Well, so there were many things like that from the University of Houston master's degree and these others where I didn't go on and get a degree, but it was a big thing for me to be with these different kinds of people. If I know my own heart, I love everybody, and I wanted everybody to be right. And so I didn't mind talking with people, and they didn't mind talking to me.
Getting back to the actual debate with Flew, who were the main people who helped you prepare for it? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you did prepare for it. Maybe how many months it took to get ready, and what were some of the things you did?
Well, let me, and in response to that, let me say that for all of my life, starting at a certain time when I went to college, well, it was when I got back from the Air Force during World War II. I made up my mind when I was on an island in the South Pacific that if I ever got home, I would spend my life in trying to preach the gospel. I wasn't trying to make a bargain with God or anything like that to say, if you'll just get me back, well, I'll do that. But I made that commitment, and I've tried to live up to it. And so I studied in these different schools that I've already mentioned to you, some of them conservative, some very, very liberal, and with men, some of the faculty members that were known very well all over this country. And it was amazing to me how easily handled they were when they didn't know the Bible, even if it wasn't on a Bible subject. And so biblical study has been a wonderful thing to me, and I just don't know how to thank God for it.
So your entire life in studying and preaching was set the background for your being able to deal with somebody like Flew, in addition to your academic credentials.
Yes, to be able to handle whatever type of thing comes up to challenge the church. If it's some denominational doctrine, we ought to be qualified to do that, to take care of it. And if it's atheism, agnosticism, and other things, then we need to be able to handle that. It's really distressing to me today to see how few people in the Lord's church today, among the preachers, that I think are trying to qualify themselves to do that. And many times the ones that go off to school and get doctor's degrees, they come back and they're weaker than they were when they went.
Did you have any special people helping you, such as moderators or people helping with the charts? Or?
First of all, I'd like to say that my whole program from the time of my commitment to being that, I tried to prepare myself to do it. And with that in mind, I studied logic very diligently, several years, and taught it years. But so far as the people who are, that I feel most indebted to in regard to this, are your granddad, Roy Deaver, one of the, as I've already said, as dear a friend as I have on earth. And he's extremely qualified, very brilliant. And there are other men like that, other men in Christian colleges. And we talked many times when I was at lectureships on those places. And we would try to give one another problems, you know, that you would make it hard for you to solve it. And we'd dig into that. And we'd have practice debates on these things. All the things that we're trying, that we best we knew, of how to prepare ourselves to do that. And as I read the Bible, I see where there are constant confrontations. It isn't just a matter that you come down to this church building over here and I'll preach you a sermon and so forth. It was a matter of going out into the highways and byways and striking up a battle, as it were, though it was a loving battle. I didn't ever try to whip somebody, the individual, but to try to help him to see the truth.
I've heard that this debate was very well attended. Do you have any figures relating to how many people actually came to the debate?
We checked with the people who ran the auditorium where it was, and we were told that the average was somewhere around 6,300 for the 4 nights. That it reached over 7,000, I think it was maybe the second night. And in an average of a little over 6,000. And the people in the, the people that guided people to their seats and all that, we talked some to them, and they said, we've never seen a crowd like this here. And that's a big auditorium. It's a big coliseum at North Texas State University.
Was there any local publicity or even national publicity surrounding the debate?
Well, there were newspaper ads. That's about the extent of what we had.
It seemed like quite a few people still
Yes,
showed up.
they surely did. Can you imagine what would happen if the Lord's church had kept up that kind of thing from then until now? Let's say 4 or 5 of them every year. Just think how many thousands of people and the kind of motivation that would be developed.
I know that part of your agreement that you had with Flew for the debate was that you were able to exchange true-false questions with one another. Could you tell us something about what Flew did with your questions once you gave them to him?
Yes, each night we had the privilege of extending to the other person 10 questions. And you could put them true or false, or however you wanted to put it. And Dr. Flew never gave me one question, not one. And I gave him 10 every night. But he left unanswered, completely unanswered. One night it was 4 questions out of the 10 I asked him that he didn't give any answer at all. And another one was 3, another one was 2, and another one was 1. So you see, that is an elimination of a lot of questions that should have been answered. But nevertheless, he answered enough that it just really, to use an expression, it cut his throat in his being able to be in the program with any power.
Well, how would you rate Flew as an opponent? As far as his academic credentials, I guess there was nobody better than he to represent the atheistic position, and yet he was unable to handle the questions that you gave him.
Well, I heard him in a different setting, in the one I was talking about earlier, at the university. I'm not sure whether it was University of Southern California or UCLA. I forget those 2 schools. It was so long ago. But he really buffaloed that crowd of philosophers, in my judgment. He was up there and he'd give the audience an opportunity to ask a question, and he would give the answer and really then challenge them to answer it. And he was carrying the day. And yet it was obvious that he was way off. It was obvious to me. And so I finally got into it on the very last one, as I mentioned a while ago. And he became very angry. He really did. And pounded the lectern, as I suggested. Knocked it over a bit. It was a bit shaky in the first place, but and another professor came from that school, whichever one it was, and he came up to me and says, Dr. Warren, I want you to know that I'm glad you showed up here today. He said, this man has been browbeating all of us all this week, and we didn't know what to do with it. So I think he was a brilliant man. Where he falls, where he did fall, is that he didn't know the Bible. He hadn't really studied through, in spite of his philosophical degree. He hadn't studied through the matter of how did man get here, and what is man, and what's the relationship, is there some higher being or something. He thought he had that all wrapped up, and he didn't at all. I think that if we will prepare the men, let's say suppose we had 50 men that could really deal with these, not just some fellow out here in a corn patch, but fellows in these great universities, and be able to whip them in public debate all over the world. Why, what kind of evangelism do you think that would be? There's no better place for the devil to get people to not obey the gospel than the modern universities. So Flew was far from being a little guy to just run over. It's just that for the first time in his life, he met the Bible. He met God's word, not human words. Now, when it came to the other, I have no doubt he could just whip them going and coming, because he did it there, and that all week that long with those fellows from all over the world.
He was the cream of the crop and highly respected worldwide as far as
I know he
circles
was.
would be concerned.
Yes.
So after one night of the Warren Flew debate, after the first night was over, let's say, how would you get ready for the second night?
Well, it was a matter, as far as I was concerned, there's no dilly-dallying around. When it was over at night, the 4 or 5 men who were with me, and your grandfather was one of them, we would go and eat a bite, and all the time we were doing that, we were arguing, you know, trying to say, what if he says this, and what if he says that, and what if we say this, and so on. And then we'd get to bed, I guess, about midnight or a little after, and then get up early the next morning and get at it. And I would draw charts. I used to be a commercial artist and cartoonist, and that, I think the Lord's really preparing me to draw charts. And so that's what we did. And I think the charts really devastated Dr. Flew. I know this may sound like I'm sort of arrogant or something, but you can just look at the book and read it and see how he would not answer so many of the questions that I asked him. And he didn't do that because he just didn't like me. He didn't do it because he didn't know how to answer it. And so we'd work all day long up until, say, mid-afternoon, take a rest, and then a final thing on it and finalize the charts. And if you've got the right charts, you're going to have that fella in a real hole. I think that Dr. Flew is one of the smartest men on earth from the standpoint of just intelligence. But you cannot be an atheist and deal with the matter of God in the Bible. You just can't do it. Not if there's somebody over there that knows anything at all about it. And so this team worked together, and we would you know, just sort of bat it around with each other and try to show that it's wrong, say the argument that we're trying to do.
Did your debate with Flew help lead to some other debates with other atheists as well?
Oh yes, and some, I think, some very well qualified men. You know, the University of California at Berkeley is not exactly a kindergarten. That's ranks as highly, I suppose, as any in the United States. And he was on the faculty of the philosophy department, Wallace Matson. And I thought he was a very qualified fellow, but I think it's clear that if you read the book with Flew, I mean the debate with Flew is printed in the book, and so is the one with Matson, and so is a following one. And I think if we could just get people to read this and see that these men are qualified to give the best argument on both sides, and you can look and see for yourself. But what many times we do, even those of us who are members of the church, we just sort of dilly-dally around and let the academic world train this nation. Just think about what some of the things that this people in this nation now believe and what they try to do and how arrogant they are in rejecting God.
Would you say, from the standpoint of having debated several atheists publicly, that did you find it extremely difficult to do that, or fairly easy to put the Bible up against their atheistic positions?
Well, I've had this experience. I have, in teaching college students, graduate students, I would have sometimes, you know, mock debates And even while I was just teaching, I would ask questions of the class that an atheist might, some of them I thought up myself as being a hard thing for somebody who's a Christian to answer. And when we first started all of that, the first year or two that a student encountered that, he would be like, just playing in mud pies with a child. He couldn't stand up to it. And in no short while, he's gone. Maybe the first question, he doesn't know what to do with it. And here he is, been studying the Bible for 10 or 15 years. That's not anything arrogant on my part. It's just the fact that these men can do that to preachers who have not studied these other matters. If you haven't studied logic, you haven't studied philosophy and the different things like that, then you're not going to be in the ball game with them. You can say, well, I'd rather just get up and preach. Okay, you preach, but get somebody else then to learn how to do this, because the atheists and the agnostics are the biggest dangers that we have. If you convince people that there's no God, it's silly to even go about talking about Christ.
Do you think that atheism is growing in America?
Oh, I think it is. At the time following the third debate that I had with an atheist, my own health failed from the standpoint of my heart disease. I've had 3 open heart surgeries. And so I had to quit, or else, just go on and push it and die from it. I think I've been able to do a lot more things than I would have been dead by staying here, doing the best I could with it at least. And so I think we're going to have to go to the top level of educated people. Now, that doesn't mean you don't educate, you don't try to reach everybody. But the people who can have the most influence, by and large, to spread out, are the academic professors. And all the people that go there, even, our youngsters today, from members of the church, just think about how many are going away from the truth now. And they're doing that because they're taught these ungodly doctrines out of these universities here in the United States. We ought to have men who could go to every university in this country and challenge them to a public debate on the existence of God, the inspiration of the Bible, and the one church, and so on. These great factors that are involved in basic Christianity.
So you would certainly consider debating to be extremely important aspect of defending the truth.
Yes. Paul said, prove all things. Now, a lot of people think proving just means making a statement, but that's not it. Proving it means proving it. This is true, therefore this is true. You've got to have valid arguments. You've got to have all the premises true. And when you have that, it's unget-overable. But if you don't have it, then you don't have anything.
It seems like today there are not nearly as many debates as there were perhaps 30, 40 years ago. Do you think that the Lord's Church is worse off because of that?
Oh, yes. And what debating we're doing is over some relatively minor problem within the church. Members of the church are debating members of the church, and they're not debating these people here who have the whole world in their hands, that there is no God, and that man is here by evolution. The doctrine of evolution is a devastating thing. You can see it almost every day in our newspapers. They'll have something, well, see here, this is this. They're come to the point now that they hardly even think they should argue the thing, they just state it as a fact.
There seem to be a lot of members of the church who have no respect or appreciation for debating and see no significance to it, or perhaps even dislike it, and would charge debaters with being mean or unloving.
Mm-hmm.
How would you answer that kind of a charge from somebody?
Well, it sort of reminds me of a old saying I knew when I was a little kid, and that is that muley cows don't like hooking contests. And if you don't know what you're doing, you'd better stay out of a debate with these university professors, because they're going to make you look bad. But if you spend the time, you pay the price to get ready. And I know a lot of young men who have the intelligence to do that. And then you can defeat them. You can defeat men like Antony Flew, like Wallace Matson, and others. And that can just turn the whole world around. Can you imagine what would be a good answer to say, why? What are we waiting on? What are the young men of today that are learning to preach? What are they waiting on to get ready to do that? I tend to think that if I learn a few sermons and so forth, then I'm all ready. But the biggest thing against us is atheism and agnosticism and unity in diversity. Unity in diversity is very rampant in the Lord's church. And many of the Christian colleges that used to be really strong are now just right in it with them. Now, who's going to do anything about that? You can't do it if you don't know how to handle it. Now, I know we've got young men that are strong, that are intelligent. They're just as intelligent or more intelligent than any person that we've dealt with. And it can be done. And I'm certainly hoping and praying that it will be done.
Now, you mentioned agnosticism a couple of times, and you are extremely concerned about it and the damage that it is doing to the Lord's church today. Could you briefly explain exactly what agnosticism is and why you consider it such a crucial threat?
Well, basically, it's the doctrine that you can't know anything. But you see, that thing's already killed itself. If nobody can know anything, then you can't know that you can't know anything. Isn't that true?
It would be.
So agnosticism is really killed that easily. But when you bring an agnostic in and you see him up against, talking against a fellow that hasn't really paid his price to get ready for it, then the agnostic will look good as over against the Christian. And many of the people who are members of the church today are really agnostics. They hold that, well, you ought to let this go and then let him hold this and I'll hold this, and there the twain shall meet, but we don't want to break any fellowship.
Why do you think agnosticism has taken on such popularity?
Well, it's greatly popular in our society. It's almost as if you were doing a bad thing to even question agnosticism. Oh, you're going to say you know it and he doesn't? See, that would be arrogant. But it's arrogant to be an agnostic and claim that nobody knows anything. Except you have to put a PS on there and say, except I.
I know that you stress very strongly the study of and the use of logic, and you've done a lot of teaching and writing on that subject. Do you think that the average Christian can understand logic?
Well, of course. If we couldn't understand logic, let's just imagine that I go out and get in my car and I go downtown and here's a red light. And over here I can see that this big truck is coming on and he's got a green light. And I know a little bit about red and green lights. But I go up and I don't decide that I should stop. I just run right out in front of that big truck. What'll happen to me? You see, we're all logical. Some people are more intelligent, they're more logical than others, but you couldn't function. They'd have to put you in some kind of a dungeon or a field where there was a high wall so you couldn't get outside if you weren't logical. And so everybody is. And the Bible says, when it says prove all things, that's demanding that you use logic. How would I determine that the Bible applies to me? My name's not in it. Thomas Bratton Warren does not appear in the Bible. But neither does Weylan Deaver. So here you and I'd be left out. But we study it, and we say, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. That means everybody living. And lo, I'll be with you always, even at the end of the world. We're ascribed to it, and it's going to last till the end of the world. So that's all of it.
Mm-hmm. So people who can see the necessity of logic just in everyday things, so oftentimes it seems like when it comes to the Bible and when it comes to religion, they don't see the need to apply logic in that area as well. but we ought to, and we ought to not be intimidated by the study of logic, but to realize how important it really is.
That's right. And just take a simple thing. Suppose you say all boys are masculine and Bill is a boy, and so what would be the conclusion? Bill is masculine. We all do that. Even people have never even heard of logic. It's just done. The human mind does that. But when you study logic, you learn how to do very intricate things. And these atheists bring up a lot of intricate things.
Let me ask you one last question. Now, looking back 20 years after the fact, do you have any final thoughts on the significance of your debate with Flew?
Yes. My plan was that I would keep meeting men like that. I had several other men in line. Now, some of the men who the various magazines have said, this man is willing to take on anybody, and he knows that evolution is true and that creation is false. And you challenge those men and they won't do anything about it. And sometimes they try to cover up the fact that he's doing that. But there are a number of men, and I was involved in being in contact with them. A man from New York University, and a man from Princeton. Those men are not topwaters, as we say. They're men of great learning. And the fact that they were willing to test what they say with the Bible, with the existence of God and all, was an enormous thing. One man I remember said that he had to go to Europe for the summer, I think a couple of months for the summer, and said, when we get back, we'll sign the propositions. Now, this is a very well-known man. I'm not going to mention his name, but he went over there, and while he was there, he had some malady, a bleeding. Some organ was ruptured, and he lasted only a few hours. And so there went a very great opportunity for debating. And a man in New York University has already indicated that he would sign the propositions when we got finalized on them. And he became ill. And other things like that indicate that these people are not afraid. The men who are the giants in the academic world, they're not afraid of a fellow out here. They have to learn, though, if they meet a man who's a Christian, knows the Bible, knows logic, knows philosophy, he'll find out that he cannot stand in it. He cannot hold up the whole thing. And I don't know of anything that would make people see better the truthfulness of Christianity and to cause the members of the church to quit dallying around with these silly, out-of-the-way doctrines and get back on the track that we have been in the past and keep on training our young men who have the capacity to do it. And if we have to pay them the money, to give them the money to go to school, those schools where you get really high standards of teaching are very, very expensive. But we need to do that. And you need to be sure that somebody doesn't knock him off. It's always a danger if you go there and study that you're not going to have this spizzerinctum to say that I'm going to stay with it. I've seen some fall by the wayside. But you take one man in his lifetime, might even turn this whole nation around.
Well, we know that though your debate with Flew took place 20 years ago, it still continues to do good even today with people who read the book. I know I studied the book and watched the tapes when I was in school, and many other people have done that and will do that in the future as well. So it will continue to have a great impact, I'm sure, for the good. And we want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to sit down and talk with us, to answer these questions. And I want you to know that we sincerely appreciate your life and all of the good that you have done over the years in debates with Flew and atheists like him, all of your preaching work and all of the writing work that you have done. And will continue to do in the future, and we certainly pray that God will bless you with many more years of useful service in His kingdom. So we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time to do this, and wish you all the best.
Thank you. I'd like to say one more word, that I could wish that we could go through Dr. Flew's answers to my 40 questions in that debate. We had 10 questions each night, and see how many he skipped, how many he refused to answer, to give any answer at all, and how when he did answer, he in effect broke his own neck. Now that ought to indicate to young men such as yourself, I know you already understand this, but to fire you up, to work to a doctorate and do this and challenge these men. Take the initiative. I know you can do it. And I hope every young man in the country that has the ability will do it.
Thanks again, Brother Warren.